First Amendment is quickly dying. How much time do we as Americans have in comparison to countries like the UK and Brazil?
Well, the story of what's happening in the UK and Brazil is very tightly connected to our own. And we'll get to this when we talk about some of the international issues happening right now. But the U.S. State Department is actually putting pressure on foreign countries to enact their own censorship laws. So I don't really see what's happening in the UK or Brazil as being distinct from the U.S. But in terms of how much time we have left, this is one of these spaces where there's a lot of 2 steps forward, 1 step back, 3 steps back, 1 step forward. You can lose, and lose badly even, for a number of years, and then begin to make inroads again. There was, for the first 6 years of me doing this, I've been involved in this space for 8 years now, just dedicated my whole life to it. And for the first 6 years, there was no traction at all. It was one loss after another. And that does make you feel hopeless, but you just keep putting one foot in front of the other until you start to get victories. And then we've had a lot of victories on the free speech space in the past 18 months, and go through them if folks are interested. But
I think it would be good to go through them just for the positivity aspect.
Totally. So coming into the year 2022, you had the censorship industry was completely invincible. And what I mean by the censorship industry is this whole of society framework that our government uses for its counter misinformation work, which ties together 4 different stakeholder institutions: government agencies, private sector companies, civil society institutions, so like universities, NGOs, researchers, and then media institutions. And all 4 of that, government, private sector, civil society, and media, all work together to achieve a common censorship outcome. So they can each pull their own levers in order to achieve the censorship of a narrative or of an account, or kill someone's advertising revenue, whatever needs to be done in any particular case. And from 2016, when this was all really getting established in the US, until 2022, there was never any piercing of any one of those 4 quadrants. No government agencies were under scrutiny. Most people didn't even know there was a government role. All the social media companies were completely under this pressure, and there was no one willing to break the alliance. You had Mark Zuckerberg at Facebook, who was being threatened by the federal government in terms of Facebook's bottom line. Jack Dorsey was totally pliant to these. YouTube was an avid censor in that regard. And so in 2022, a number of things happened that began to really change the turf of this. So first, there was this scandal with the Disinformation Governance Board. I don't know if folks remember this. This was this Ministry of Truth, is what people were calling it, at the Department of Homeland Security. They made the mistake for once in their lives of publicly calling it what it actually was. When the Disinformation Governance Board happened in April 2022, it was the first time that Republicans in Congress leapt to life and said, "Oh my God, there's a government censorship agency. It's the Ministry of Truth." What they didn't know is that the Ministry of Truth had already existed within DHS for 3 years before that. It was just given a much more boring, mundane name. It was called the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. But what they did is they said that because their mission is critical infrastructure security, and elections are critical infrastructure, and COVID deals with public health, and public health is critical infrastructure, any tweets that contain misinformation about elections or about COVID or about any number of sensitive policy issues were a cyber threat actor, were a cyber attack on critical infrastructure. And so DHS had this giant web apparatus to censor First Amendment protected speech using a cybersecurity predicate. But at the time, that was almost too fantastical for people to believe. It wasn't until DHS's censorship operations became so sprawling and so massive and had so many touch points that they needed this dull, boring, bureaucratic management layer, the Disinformation Governance Board, to manage what DHS, CISA, and the intelligence wing of DHS INA was doing. And so it was only then that you had Chuck Grassley and Josh Hawley and all these different Republican members of Congress say, holy, wait a second. We've heard rumors about internet censorship being directed by the U.S. government. Maybe they're true because, look, they have this Disinformation Governance Board. In that same month, Elon Musk announced his intended acquisition of X, and that he was spending $44 billion to set the bird free, to get rid of the censorship policies that had existed essentially from 2016 until 2022. In November of 2022, the Republicans took control over Congress. In October of 2022, Elon Musk completed his acquisition, and Republicans in Congress began to break much of this open, as did Elon Musk through the Twitter files. And so there began to be all these public hearings on government pressure on Facebook, on Amazon, on YouTube, on Twitter. Jim Jordan, the chairman of the House Weaponization Subcommittee, got us the Facebook files, which showed that Facebook was only censoring COVID-19 because they felt beholden to the Biden administration and folded under that pressure in order to be receptive to their calls to censorship, because they have bigger fish to fry on multiple policy fronts, meaning they needed the Biden State Department's help to defend their rights in Europe. They needed the Biden administration's protection of their data rights and their advertising revenues. And so when Elon kicked the door open with the Twitter files, and there began to be congressional support in Congress, many of these federal agencies started to clam up and, I won't say close down, but they had to reorganize in ways that added a lot of friction to what they did. And they became a lot less powerful because now the public awareness had grown. And anytime they did something, they would be hit with subpoenas. People would be brought in for transcribed interviews. There'd be public hearings. There'd be lawsuits. There have been many private sector lawsuits. We've had this major Supreme Court case that just sort of, in my view, was wrongly decided, but it's still a preliminary decision. So that may still play out favorably in the future. But there's been legal pressure, there's been congressional pressure, there has been the prying open of Twitter, which is X. It's the largest political thought incubator of all the social media platforms, because everyone's a content producer on there, unlike YouTube, as soon as you hit the retweet button. And that has also given cover to folks like Mark Zuckerberg to lessen censorship at Facebook and on Instagram. And this is one of the things the censorship industry has been apoplectic about, is that they accuse Mark Zuckerberg of riding Elon Musk's free speech coattails and removing a lot of the liaison tentacles that previously were back-channeled by U.S. intelligence or by political operatives involved in the censorship industry. And so the internet now is much freer than it was several years ago in the U.S. So the blob has a new strategy involving bringing international pressure on the platforms, as well as state pressure within individual states in the U.S.
Wow. So we did get some wins.
We're winning at the level the battle was being fought from 2016 to 2020. If we had what we have now, we'd be in a totally different world. The issue is as we're winning at the current level, they've moved the battle upstream to things that are existentially much more terrifying. Just straight up international laws banning First Amendment speech. We're seeing this with this new EU censorship law, the Digital Services Act, which adds a disinformation compliance component, and that forces X to censor anything NATO wants to censor, or else they lose their European market, which is a larger market than their US market. And so they have a whole bag of tricks that are the new frontier for fighting this. But if they hadn't escalated that, we would be winning quite dramatically right now.
Interesting.